I have been coming to the realization that the current worldwide compulsory schooling/education system is fundamentally flawed at its very roots. If a child is to be educated, it should be by the parents or some local guide who educates it. Also, who is to say a child even needs what we call education? A child naturally gifted for reading, literature, or science will find their way no matter what. And as for the vast mass of others, there should be guilds for the learning of arts and crafts. Ultimately, the goal of childhood development should not be the mass production of workers, but the fostering of good, ethical people. Our current system fails utterly in this respect. What advice, if any, do you have for parents today? And then I'll add on to this that we're told now, to be unilingual, you have to force yourself into this box, and we're told that you need to go through high school and then bachelor's and master's and PhD, and if you don't do these things, then you're meaningless and you have no value. Whereas people for the longest time just learned languages. They didn't learn languages in textbooks, they just were naturally multilingual, and you might have an illiterate peasant who spoke 8 or 10 languages. And I've seen this actually in villages in Morocco. I've seen illiterate people who speak languages with an incredible gift, and scholar monks of the Middle Ages, they would not have what we know as education. They would need a skill such as learning to use the pen or to write, and they would get this. But the whole entire idea of a general education, of learning all sorts of different things that you have no interest in or aptitude for, is something completely new and modern and has its origin only about 200 years ago. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how this is affecting childhood development and what your recommendation for parents and children are.
When people were thinking about systems of education, that one had produced impressive results. Not necessarily well-educated, good people, because it was sort of built along the lines of military training.
How prescient.
Yes, exactly. And of course, very disciplined. I'd say that public education should be widely available, and that it should teach the practicalities of the world that the children have to grow up into. It teaches them certain skills that you just kind of have to know to navigate, and the parents should instill the joy of learning. But I really feel like compulsory education it has some merit at some stage of life, perhaps, but that beyond a certain point, education should be easily available and encouraged and free. And then you could let these children start finding their way, and they would find what their heart drew them to, and presumably if they love it, they will excel in it, or at least they'll acquire the skills to have a happy life doing it. But the mass production of workers, or originally, I think, the mass production of citizens, is just inevitably ends up to be somewhat soul-crushing. You need to train people for life, certain basic life skills that they're going to need, and teach them the value of acquiring the knowledge they need or enjoy, and then it's fine. This whole thing about having to retrain workers and things like that, I mean, that should be a given. If anybody says, my job is going away, or I can't do this anymore, the society should support them acquiring new skills. I mean, it should just be a given.
Well, yes. I mean, stepping back from this, let's see if we can take this on fundamental terms here. When you have a child, what you want for that child is you want them to be safe. You want them to be non-dependent, which is to say free, and you want them to be happy.
Yeah.
Some of that, I think, is best or necessarily provided by some kind of public education.
If you want to have a worthwhile culture or civilization, you need the members to have the most value possible. And knowledge, and in other words, your whole society is richer the better educated children are. But that's not to say that they all need the same kind of education.
Well, I will interject here and say on those three criteria, safe, free, and happy, my own personal experience says that the worst possible way to ensure that is public education. While I was in the public school system, I was attacked verbally and physically. I was the least happy I ever was in my life, and I felt imprisoned. And aside from all of that, it did a terrible job of actually instructing me in anything.
Yeah. You were imprisoned.
I really learned nothing in my first 12 years of school that I did not learn on my own or have taught to me by friends or family. I may have inadvertently picked things up, but that's it. Even in college, there's not much that I really learned. I didn't go to college to learn stuff. I went to college to get a degree. The fact is, I approached things in a different way than most people. Most people were there to learn things, and in the end, they ended up being able to pass some exams, but didn't really learn anything. I went and already had this desire to learn certain things, and because I already had a passion for certain things, I was so far ahead of and above and beyond the vast masses of people that were in the classes that the only real beneficial things I got out of the college system were actually outside the official classes. So I remember with joy dialogues and debates and engagement with various very great and excellent professors, but not within the context of the classroom. It was outside of the classroom. And I learned far more from almost a Platonic symposium-like dialogue among like-minded and diverging thinkers like we're having now than I ever could in any sort of institutional context.
I agree. The richness of learning is, the density of learning, if you will, is much higher in those situations because the communication is between two human beings and not between teacher and pupil. And I'd have to say that most of what has been meaning for me in life and enjoyable, I have learned on my own. And school was forced labor. I mean, there were subjects that I liked, and in those subjects, I kept thinking, hurry up and get to the good parts. But yeah, I mean, I think every civilization, there are certain things that children should learn as they grow up. And in a simpler culture, you would pick that up from your environment, the adults in your environment. And as long as the asking of questions isn't stifled and the willingness to help someone find answers is there, things can work out pretty well. But the modern world is extremely complex. There are lots of things that you can't get basically in a survey course kind of thing. I felt like when I went to college, I saw it as an opportunity to find out what I wanted to pursue, along with the things that I thought I wanted to pursue from the start. And the best part about college for me was being in a university symphony orchestra for 2 years. And apart from that, it was the people I met and the growth that occurred from that. I spent a lot of time in the library pursuing things that had piqued my interest. It was a good environment for learning, but the routine methods just weren't that functional. And when the goal is to pass a test, nobody is learning about learning.
Say that again.
When the goal is just to pass a test, no one is learning about learning.
Right, and that really speaks to what education is about today. It's about test scores.
I mean, that's why some systematic approach might be justified, to make sure everyone gets the experience, the positive experience of learning. Children will get that naturally while they're young. I mean, look how fast children pick up languages. children can be raised, trilingual without any real problem at all. They're learning machines. So, yeah, I mean, we've structured the joy out of learning for sure.
And sorry, was someone going to say something?
Well, I don't need to interrupt you. I can come back to this point. It's not a follow-on, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know many people that have gone through the entire system and, let's say, gotten a PhD in German, and yet I can speak German better than them and read things in German that they have difficulty with, and yet I only have had a year of German in college, whereas for me, I learned it in two different ways. I learned it by basically street German, picking it up, actually talking to people. And then
Right.
in terms of reading, back before I ever took a class in another language in my life, I saw somewhere that Tolstoy learned biblical Greek by reading 2 copies of the Bible side by side with a good dictionary. So I decided, you know what, there's some works I love in the German language. And I found a good, fairly literal English version and a German version and a good German dictionary and a good German grammar, and I went through it slowly. And I didn't need a teacher. I didn't need answer keys or exercises or anything. I had motivation because it was a work that I loved. And I picked it up and I remembered things and I internalized it because of that. But when someone's in a class, it doesn't matter how many years. They can pick up all the mechanics of something, but they don't internalize it because it's all part of a system rather than something that comes from actual devotion or love.
Right. I did the same thing with German because I was really interested in chemistry, and a lot of the standard chemical reactions and things like that had been worked out by the Germans. And I suspect that German used to be pretty much a necessary language for a chemist. So I would I would see a reference to something and say, oh, I'd like to look that up and find out it's in this giant volume chemistry books called Berichte. And I did that. I sat down. I was motivated to learn how to make some drugs some of the time, and a German dictionary, and I figured it out. I didn't learn much grammar, but I was amazed that I could figure out what they were telling me in German. So yeah, and I think that points to the difference between teaching and learning. Teaching assumes a passive recipient and an active teacher, and yet learning is an activity, not passive. You have to actively engage or you don't learn, which is one of the reasons that I finally learned that the best place in the class was in the front row, so I could be as engaged as possible. Not so I could be seen, so that I could have my attention a whole lot more on what was going on there, and being physically closer to the teacher is a little bit more like having an interaction.
Yes, and probably actually promotes real interaction.
It does.
So, as I was saying a few minutes ago, a couple of years ago at a TED Summit conference, I was asked to lead a discussion and I was asked to pick the topic. And my topic was, in a world where all information is instantly available, what is it you really need to know? Consequently, what should education be about? And it was an interesting group. And finally, there was really a consensus about the answer. And the thing that the group felt education should be about is character.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's not about information.
Right. No, it's not. And it's also very clear that school is not very good at teaching character. There's something to be said for more military type schools. They actually do teach a little bit of character because you have to do things you don't want to do, and you have to learn some self-control.
Yes, well, one of the things people regret about their lives is not having enough discipline. That's like number 3 on the list. And one of the things you generally get from military settings like that is the development of self-discipline.
Yeah, but if you were to get a proper education, one of the things you would learn is that if you can't be on top of your own resistance, your own difficult behavior, that you can't learn.
Right.
That it takes directed attention to learn. So,
Well, it also takes teaching.
well, yeah, it does. It does. I mean, a kid's not going to suck everything that he needs out of the air. And you need models of good character as well as lessons in good character. So, well, the healthier society is, the more osmotic the learning process can be.
I think that's right. I think Seda Badria would agree.
Oh, I imagine.
Yes.
So we need teachers who are worthy to teach, not just the people who have been trained in methods, because a method completely ignores the child.
Yeah, then it gets to be about the method, not about learning.
Right.
Often happens. It's inevitable with that set of values.
And that's what you get in teacher education and training.
Methods. That's right. Well said. I think that's certainly right.
I was just going to make a observation that it's interesting when one learns the history of modern ideas of education and how they came about. Our modern ideas of education actually, I believe, started in the 12th century, and I believe it was Hugh of St. Victor that said, we need to teach people well in the monasteries so that they don't learn things poorly outside of the monasteries. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a very noble thing. But this idea of we need to teach people right so that they don't learn it wrong has actually ended up as this perverse sort of Frankenstein monster that we're talking about now.
Yeah, but the trait that abuses that thing, I think, has always been with us. And it can start as innocently as making sure the child doesn't learn something wrong. And on a practical level, yeah. But when it comes to ideology, it starts to be a problem. And of course it starts with religion, because there's truth there, and outside of it, truth is pretty sketchy. So naturally it would start in the monasteries. I can't remember right now the name of the author. There were two people I was reading at one time, and one of them was the guy that wrote the book Dumbing Us Down about education. And he was I think a teacher in New York who had won all kinds of state top awards for being a teacher and everything. And it's an interesting book, but it draws on some other works that are kind of lengthy and dense, and I cannot remember who that was. It might come to me, but I'm not sure. It's in that two or three authors that I learned enough about the history of education and how it had gone wrong.